just understand that that is not the essence of what the church has tried to use these various tools to point to as we've celebrated Christmas for hundreds and hundreds of years. I don't think the church should be anti-Christmas. Christmas is ours. We made it. We recognized it. We didn't make it, but we came up with the idea of celebrating Christmas. It is our holiday. Friends, welcome back to the Pastor Talk podcast. We continue our Christmas series, our Advent series about some of the trappings of Christmas. Today, literally the trappings of Christmas as we move from the big picture kind of down to the small picture and talk Christmas decorations. If you've never stopped to think about it, it is really amazing the amount, just the sheer number of ways in which we decorate for Christmas, whether that's nativity sets, lights on the house, a tree, the stuff that goes on the tree. For most people, Christmas season involves hanging something, displaying something, arranging something, installing something. It's a big part of the holiday for most people.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can think of a number of sort of grandiose examples. The White House, they have a massive gingerbread house they build every year. Somewhat famously, Walt Disney Company puts massive gingerbread houses in their big hotels. Those are sort of, and then you think of Rockefeller Center, you got this massive, I mean, it's a tree, right? Not like the small little bushes we put in our houses. I mean, they get a legit tree that rivals skyscrapers, and they stick it in the middle of their square, and then you've got the sort of a visual image underneath that of people, ice skating. And then I think of my own family members' houses growing up. You've got the whole Christmas displays, right, with all the beautiful, perfectly lit houses. And then you've got like the talking Santa Clauses. You got all of the different things that are supposed to help us celebrate Christmas. And as we turn to this conversation from a pastor's perspective, Clint, we're going to have to maybe learn a little bit about how we get to where we're at, but ultimately we're going to ask the question, how do these things help us, and where do these things provide opportunities for us to miss the true source of the season? I want to start, though, with just one quick comment. That is, it's actually become a trope unto itself, I think, this idea of the reason for the season. And I think it is intending to point us in the right direction. In other words, it's to say, focus on Jesus, focus on the faith side of the Christmas story. I'm all good with that. I think the trope-ish part of that statement is it's sort of culturally become looped into the idea of nativities, the idea of sing the old Christmas songs, which aren't necessarily bad, but as we've already talked about, our general understanding and imagination of what the nativity scene is not entirely biblically accurate. In fact, I would say in some ways it's very inaccurate. And so one of the tasks is indeed to try to look around the trappings of the stuff, the halls that we've decked, if we're going to look at the title of this episode, and really ask, to what extent can we really be clued into the reason, but the real reason, not some of even the cultural reasons we've come to accept.
What I think is interesting, Michael, we alluded to it early in this series, is because those things are kind of sacred, and I use that word loosely, they are very deeply important to us. We assume that it has always been that way. And so part of, I think, when we push back against the reason for the season, or when we push back with a slogan like the reason for the season, we might be talking about, a change of the tradition. And I think what is interesting is how often it tends to be the case that the tradition we take as a beloved and almost inseparable part of Christmas didn't start there. In some cases, wasn't a part of Christmas for millennia or centuries, and in other cases, wasn't a Christian thing at all but the Christians ended up doing it sometimes for legitimate and good reasons, sometimes for reasons that have some suspicious motives. And I think if we understand that, it gives us opportunity to have a broader conversation about how the ways in which we celebrate Christmas honor and connect with the heart of it, which I think is what's intended in that kind of pushback, but sometimes not fully understood.
Okay, so I believe in full transparency. One of the pastors who come to this conversation came with notes, and it wasn't me. So let's show them to the fine people at home. Here they are. Here's the notes. So Clint, I think you get to start. Lead us into some of the history here of the decking the halls.
Yeah, so I'm going to admit, Michael, that I join many people in looking at some of our Christmas traditions and wondering, where did they come from? I have a basic working understanding of some of it, but I wanted to make sure, and there were some things I checked that I maybe wouldn't in anticipation of talking decorations. So I do come a little bit armed. Probably the big place we start is the Christmas tree. Christmas trees are interesting in that they predate Christmas by a long time. There is a long history of people celebrating the midwinter holiday, typically the solstice, with trees because they were green, because at the point of solstice, the days begin getting longer, and trees, evergreens and greenery were often brought into people's homes as an homage to, as a worship of whatever those people's sun god were. All the way back to the Egyptians with Ra. In Roman times, it was the god Saturn. In fact, that holiday, the 21st of December in the Roman world, was called Saturnalia, and there were trees. That's also where holly essentially comes from. They were the idea of colorful and plentiful and red and green. Those things were around the early Christians, but they didn't belong to Christianity. And it was a while before Christians gave some traction to the idea of Christmas. But when they did, particularly when they did midwinter, that December-ish, there were Christians. December 25th, as you probably know, wasn't always Christmas, but it was often kind of around then for many. And the idea of bringing in the tree seemed natural, and instead of honoring these other gods, they decided that they could use that tradition to honor and celebrate Christ, though I think, as we've said in every one of these conversations, it wasn't unanimous. There was some strong pushback against the idea because some saw it as a pagan idea.
Sure, right. So there's two themes here. One is going to be a through line in this entire accommodation, and that is accommodationism. To what extent do Christians and should Christians and can Christians accommodate the practices of the world? And even you would go so far as to say other worshiping practices. The church has accommodated and even transformed religious practices in a dizzying number of places, times, and cultures, and we're talking over thousands of years. So this is a theme that I don't want to make sound like it is universally agreed upon. It's certainly not. There's pushback from actually both sides of that issue, that we should accommodate more, we should accommodate less. That's a theme that's going to go through this conversation. I think another theme that will be specifically related to that, Clint, is what do we do with the particular crossovers of the theological images? So you talk about how the sun god, right, Ra for the Egyptians and Saturn for the Romans, this becomes an opportunity for Christians to ask the question, how does this interface with the Christian theme of Jesus Christ as the light of the world? As the actual world starts receiving more light, that is a moment in which Christians say, that can point us to Christ. Bringing the green living things into the house at a time in which everything else is dying or looks dead is a moment to remember, even in Christ's birth, resurrection. So Christians look at this particular moment and ask, how can this serve for the worshiping of the true God? Now, that's not without disagreement, but it is to say they become a visible, physical reminders of a faith that is complicatedly, I just made up a word, I'm sorry, a very nuanced in its interfacing with other competing religious traditions. I mean, non-Christian traditions. And so how do they navigate that? I mean, they do it with time. When we put a tree in our house without even thinking about Saturn, right, that's because of the fruit of generations of Christians that have gone on and no longer saw that as a threat.
However, Michael, I would like to at least introduce the possibility that in some sense that tension stays with us because, yes, certainly there are few to none who look at their Christmas tree and see the vestiges of pagan worship. Very few people know that they are, when they put up their Christmas tree, they are participating in something that was once a thoroughly pagan celebration of other gods, of false gods, of idols. So that has really disappeared for us. That's not really in the mix. However, because of where we live and how we live with the bigger picture of Christmas, it would be interesting to talk to people who put up Christmas trees and ask them, what does the tree mean for you? And in most of those cases, you wouldn't hear Jesus. In fact, if you talk to young people and showed them pictures of Christmas tree, what are you going to hear? You're going to hear Santa, right? That's where Santa, the tree possibly still points to something outside of the church. And I think that speaks to where we get with most of these conversations, the need to kind of be intentional, the need to recognize when I put up a Christmas tree, yes, I am just participating in a Christmas tradition, but Christians did that initially because they wanted those themes that they believed it represented to be used in service to the gospel, to be used in service of the coming of the Christ. And I think that struggle still remains with us.
Sure. So to what extent can the Christmas tree be baptized is an interesting question. And fundamentally, would the earliest Christians who advocated for its adoption in the midst of Christian homes, would they agree that that experiment has borne the fruit, no pun intended, that they had set out to accomplish? Who knows? What I would say, Clint, is that if Christians were the only ones who brought trees into their homes today, and that practice had died off in the relatively secularized sort of cultural practice of secular Christmas, then maybe this conversation would be less interesting. Because then you would say, well, clearly the themes that were intended to go along with that symbolic object, they have carried the day, and that the Christian interpretation has carried. Where I'll agree with you is, for me, I think the tree, less as a connection to or symbol of Santa, though you could argue that's exactly what I'm about to walk into, is for me, I think the tree is troubling in our culture, not for its former religious implication, but rather for our very present, most tempting cultural sin, which is the idea that I think for most kids, the tree fundamentally represents the place where the presents go, the literal pedestal of the stuff. And in a culture which highly values acquisition, our quality of product, the idea of having the latest and greatest. I mean, I can't even tell you, I'm not that old, the number of Christmases I've walked by or seen go by where the latest and greatest, like Snuggies was one year. I've not heard of that thing ever since then. And there was one year when I was a kid, the talking Elmo was a thing, and people were literally robbing delivery trucks that had Elmo on it so that they could have it. This year, it's can you get your hands on the latest PlayStation or Xbox? I mean, whatever it is, we proudly display, even in a wrapped form, the stuff that we prize and privilege under the tree. So I have a massive critique of the Christmas tree. I think it's a real temptation, especially for the youngest amongst us, because, my grandma, she made us, and I mean that, she made us read the Christmas story before we opened presents, and I hated it. I hated sitting through the census and the Bethlehem and good gravy. Yeah, Grandma, let's read it after we get the stuff. But, to her point, that was her way of attempting to remind us of the story being celebrated in the giving. As a kid, I'll be honest, I didn't get that story. So, I'll give you a point to say I agree that symbol tempts us into a narrative that isn't Christian. What it would look like for that narrative to be transformed, I think, would be an interesting conversation.
Yeah, I actually don't have any problem with the Christmas tree. I find that it's a very interesting history, that it began as pagan, that Christians copied it, that it essentially, as paganism, the practice of that died out, it then almost exclusively belonged to Christians at Christmas time, and then it didn't again. I think that's a really interesting life cycle for a piece of greenery. And the idea, I have no problem with a Christmas tree, and I clearly think it can easily be. We wouldn't have one in the sanctuary if there wasn't the idea that it could fit into the broader context of a faith-based Christmas. But I do think it's an interesting, we got there through a real convoluted path, which I think is of note.
Yeah, so let's talk about, and you've already alluded to this, the idea that the Christmas tree is a representation of Santa. Let's talk for a second about the literal physical representations of Santa that we put into our houses. By we, I mean some of us. I've got to confess, I don't think there is a Santa that we display in our house. And I don't think that's on accident. But what does it look like when we adopt a fictionalized image, literally drawn from the imagination of a creative person, based upon stories that are told, and we put those in our places of work, we put them in our places where we live? How does that shape our understanding of the season?
Well, yeah. Santa is, I think, again, a fascinating part of our Christmas experience, because when you're a child, it is very difficult for Santa not to be the center of your Christmas story. And what's interesting, Michael, is if you compare and contrast the Santa narrative and the Jesus narrative, and I don't want to turn this into that, but when you look at the Gospels,
right,
sparse details,
right,
lots of gaps.
Right.
When you look at the Santa Claus story, you have people who can't name the 12 disciples who can easily name the 8 reindeer, right? We have elves, we have a village, we have this elaborate backstory. Kris Kringle, the toy maker, we have these stories that are connected to that character that are in some ways far more detailed and elaborate than the central stories of the gospel, and I think that's I think that's curious. I'm not arguing there's something inherently wrong with that, but it is very hard to sing 10 songs and watch 3 movies about Christmas and then tell a 5-year-old that the guy who brings you presents while you sleep isn't the point. Right? That has to be tempered at some point. There has to be some balance there. And again, we find ourselves almost with, okay, if you're Christian, your Christmas is about Jesus.
Yep.
If not, well, here's this other alternative Christmas. Now, Christmas has some Santa has some Christian-ish roots, the idea of a saint named Nicholas, but that's not how most people get there.
No, I would completely agree that doesn't pass the smell test, and nor would I. I'm not going to walk on that ground at all. In fact, on the topic of Santa Claus, for all of my love of Christmas, I may have the strongest critique here at this juncture of the conversation. I will say this. You mentioned the very detailed narrative. And I want to use a particular word to describe that. I think it's clearly a manufactured narrative. And I mean that in all of its senses, right? In the fact that it is mechanized in its distribution. It leads to a kind of very profitable distribution pattern, right? The idea that Santa Claus is good for the economy. Santa Claus is good for makers. Santa Claus is good for stores. Santa Claus is good for kids. In some ways, Santa Claus is good for parents because they get an opportunity to see their kids light up and excited, right? That there is a kind of specificity in that I find very, very interesting. And I want to sort of just maybe make that point by saying this. It has struck me that story only becomes more and more fleshed out. Let me give you some details. So I don't know how long this has been happening, but I know that when my daughters got into elementary school, they became aware of this practice called the elf on the shelf, which comes from a book. Some very thoughtful, creative, enterprising person imagined this idea that an elf from Santa's workshop would go into little kids' rooms, and in the month of December, or in their homes really, in the month of December, as it leads up to Christmas, this elf would come to life and do these funny things. They'd be in funny poses, or they would be, doing funny actions. And when the kid wakes up, they see the elf and they would, find it funny, or it would cause them to, it sparked their imagination. So, of course, who ends up moving the elf? The parents, right? And who ends up living out this sort of imaginative story? It's the adults. And by the way, they're the ones who go take a picture of it and put it on Twitter and Facebook so that all of their friends see it. And they go to Pinterest so that they can get more ideas. This is one example. My daughters also, they go to school and they make reindeer food that gets, it's a craft that they throw out into the yard so that the reindeer or something eat. It's another narrative that's connected to the season that sort of intensifies the reality of it. Now, listen, I know there are great people who listen to this podcast, and in fact, some of you might be teachers who do reindeer food with your students. I don't want to come across as being entirely dismissive, but I do want to challenge the narrative. I do want to say, the deeper we go seeking to flesh out these characters of this civic, secular Christmas story, the more in danger we are of communicating both to our kids as well as to ourselves through the actions that we take, that this is fundamentally the core narrative of Christmas. I think at the end of the day, there is a level where Christians cannot accommodate anymore. And for me, that is an area where I believe I'm walking very close to that line. So that's a line that I'm very careful of. Now, we have a Christmas tree. It has lights. We have tons of Christmas decorations, but we've been choosy about what some of those are. And so I think, wherever you navigate that for yourself, and if you have kids or grandkids, you do that in your own family situation, that's great. The point is to be thoughtful of it.
This is a nice reversal because you're sounding a little more on the Scrooge side.
Well,
of
no,
things.
I just want to make it clear that as we seek to be honest about a faith conversation, let's be honest about what places do not seek to interface with the Christian faith.
Right.
The elf who moves in magical stuff in the month of December has no ties to faith. Now, maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe your family's comfortable with that. That's fine. But let's call it as it's true.
So that's the fundamental struggle, I think, Michael, and we've touched on it in every one of these conversations because it's inevitable when you begin to think seriously and perhaps even critically about Christmas. We have Christmas that is this secular thing, and we have Christmas that is this religious thing, and they both live under the umbrella called Christmas, and the barrier between them is very porous. They share some themes, they share some characters, they interact with each other easily and fluidly, and therefore it's easy to think that if I'm coming to the Christmas season as Christian, then every part of it joins me in that. And I think that this is that's sort of the genesis of these conversations, is that assumption should be questioned. You shouldn't. I would argue, and I want to be careful because this is an opinion, but I would argue that we do not live in a moment where you can consume Christmas unconsciously. You cannot simply assume that everything
You mean the
that
faith Christmas
falls under the label Christmas complements the side of the fence that is the faith Christmas.
Yeah.
I think you have to be able to say there's good and bad out there, just as those early Christians did. They brought in the trees. There were plenty of other things the pagans were doing in their winter solstice celebrations that the Christians said, no, we're not going to make that part of how we honor Jesus. It doesn't fit. And I think that tension remains.
So I want to maybe turn this conversation a little bit towards the positive end because, fundamentally, what I hear you speaking to here is this idea of discernment, right? Discerning of what is and what isn't. And I do think for some of us, the challenging word that has to be said first is discernment remains a Christian practice. It has been historically, and it remains today. There should be nothing that is Christmas that just sneaks by because it has Christmas in the label. I think as people of the faith, we should be thoughtful about how we decorate, what accoutrements we allow in. The reformers have spoken poignantly, really from the beginning, about the danger of idolatry. And I think there's really no moment where idolatry sneaks more sneakily than the Christmas season. That said, I also want to honor that it's more than just what the thing means, that there's history, there's context, there's relationship, there's emotion, there's affection, there's the way in which it's not just about the symbol of the thing, which is an important and maybe even essential, maybe even above all other things. I mean, I think that'd be a very reformed perspective. But there's also, this was a thing that my mom had. This is a thing that my grandma had. This is a practice that has been handed down throughout our family. And the recognition that some of our especially extended family celebrations of Christmas are honestly not inherently Christian. They may be inherently secular, that they may not be Christian people joining us at the table if they're not believers. And if that's the case, then that's even more navigating the recognition that my kids went to this house where it's all Santa Claus and it's all that story. And then we come to our house and they ask, Mom, Dad, why don't we have a Santa Claus? Or we do, but it's a small Santa Claus. Those then become opportunities, I think, for conversation. I wouldn't necessarily say, even though some of these narratives I don't find compelling from the faith perspective, that they are inherently wrong-headed or that symbol is by definition incongruent with the ability to be Christian. I mean, dangerous does not mean evil. And, I think I would try walk that line.
Certainly. I found it interesting if the research I did is accurate, and I believe it to be, there are surprisingly 3 categories of decoration, I guess, that are Christian. We started them. And that would be lights on the tree. That was a new thing. Martin Luther gets credit for it. It's not entirely clear that he was the first to do it. It's also not entirely clear that he wasn't. But that was candles, and the idea was to celebrate. The story goes he looked out, saw stars, and wanted to bring that sense of majesty inside. So tree lights were a specific thing that Christians did to reinforce the idea that that tree pointed to Jesus Christ. The other one also has to do with the tree, that is decorations. The first decorations were simple. They were mostly edible. They were hung there and then eaten, fruits, nuts, those kind of things, and little small decorative things that held the candles in place. Although that quickly gave way, this happened in England to porcelain and glass baubles, and that became huge. The Victorians had a practice among the wealthy that you displayed your wealth as a sign of status, and so consequently Christmas trees got bigger, they went in front of windows, and they became elaborately decorated. And Americans bought into that. Americans in the late 1800s, sort of patterning themselves after that Victorian idea, spent $25 million, and that's in the late 1800s, on tree decorations, which is a staggering number for its day. And tinsel was also a part of that. Tinsel was originally silver, and again, it was meant to show, it was a show of wealth. It was a show of success. Later on, they tried aluminum. It was a bad idea. It was flammable. It didn't mix well with the candles. And they tried lead, which was later, unfortunately, discovered to be toxic. The only other specifically Christian thing, and this one makes probably the most sense, is the Nativity, which was started by St. Francis of Assisi. He had to get permission from the Pope. He did a live outdoor Nativity, and then a preaching, had a person presenting the gospel of the Christmas story following that. So those are really the only three things we can lay claim to that specifically are ours. Now, the Nativity set, you could argue that one is still pretty much within our sphere, I think. The others we've probably shared, one could argue lost, but certainly we've at least farmed out to the culture around us.
Yeah, I don't think anyone sees a lit up tree and thinks that that's a Christian symbol of the majesty of God. Certainly. So the question that comes to all of these different sort of conversation points is, as you look around your home, you look around the decorations that are there, you've decked your own halls, right? And you see these things. On one hand, I think a valid critique of this conversation is, guys, wow, 32 minutes in and you're way overthinking this, right? Like, this is a time of year, families get together. This is an aesthetically pleasing way to decorate our homes, to bring some light and green and good inside spaces that in this season are dark and, quite frankly, need brightened. And on that level, I think you make a fine point. I mean, in fact, I think the fact that Christians ultimately did come, though there was, of course, always some debate, but Christians did come to adopt the symbol of the tree, to bring the lights inside their home, to do these different things, is because ultimately there is a kind of Christian awareness that there's a liturgical pattern to our lives. There's a kind of seasons of living. And the fact that this has been historically, in ancient times, a moment in which humans have recognized the need for celebration, and the fact that we continue to incorporate some of these symbols and some of this levity into our homes, I think that is a defensible thing. The question, I really believe, Clint, is one of what lessons we pass on. I think it's the stories that are told because of them. I firmly believe this, though there's not a Santa Claus that looks over our dinner table, that you could be a Christian family with the dancing Santa Claus you almost punched that one night, right? That could be in your home and your family telling the story of Christ in what you do and what you say. I think that's entirely possible. The question, though, is that a practice that we have taken upon ourselves? And And where this deck the halls conversation, I think for me, is interesting is there's been a whole lot of pushback publicly on this idea of like taking nativities off of public spaces and sort of like the seclusion of some of these Christian images from public life. And I'm certain there are challenges that would need work through there, Clint. But I think a far more pressing issue that we all have to deal with is how do we, amidst all of these other myriads of symbols, which quite frankly, I think for most of us, especially in America, they blend together in a very synchronous way. How do we tease out these threads in a way that they remain meaningful for us personally? And then I would once again continue to emphasize that they become meaningful for the kids and grandkids who will follow, because the more and more that we practice secular Christmas holiday, the less and less likely they are to understand the distinctive narrative of the Christian faith. And I think that we as Christians, that is our primary focus and goal. And if we don't hear that as the through line of this conversation, I think two pastors haven't done their job.
It's just a really strange reality, Michael, that a holiday that at its core is Jesus Christ can be celebrated without any consideration of that we have this thing called Christmas that was birthed by the church in celebration of the birth of the Savior. And yet, many of the things of Christmas are not Christian. They're not inherently of Christ. They don't resonate. They don't reference Jesus intentionally. So we, the people of Christ, have to insert intentionality into our Christmases. It doesn't mean that these things are wrong. I think far too often the church gets caught up in that yes or no. Can you have a Santa? Can you have a tree? Can you put lights on your house? Those really aren't the questions. The questions are, can you use those things to reinforce your faith? It is fascinating. We all know someone who would say they absolutely love Christmas. They go crazy on their house. They put decorations up everywhere. We wouldn't know a thing about that person's faith based on how they celebrate the holiday. And that is a strange reality of this time we all love. It is, I think, evidence that we have to be careful. Another good example, I found this staggering. Americans spend $6 billion a year on Christmas decorations. That is an incredible amount of money. Arguably, there are people who spend more on Christmas decorations than they give to charity. That can't be a Christian practice. The idea that I lift up Christmas does not mean that I lift up Christ, and we shouldn't treat them as synonymous. We should treat them as two separate things. If I want to do one, fine, but let me do it in service to the other one, which is most important and is at the core of my life. And that should be the Savior, not the holiday.
So I think a counterpoint to this is, what would it look like if you decorated your home per the biblical narrative? You're gonna reach a dead end pretty quick. And that's, I think, intentional, that you're not going to be trying to recreate Bethlehem in your home. You're not going to be trying to recreate the sparse sort of telling of Jesus' being born. I think, Clint, one of the things that we might miss in the conversation is that while the biblical story of Jesus' birth is dark and gritty and earthy, it's very dirt and animal and stable and just trying to make it, right? You also have the story of the shepherds, who are the same kind of people. I mean, they're really living the same kind of life that both Joseph and Mary are experiencing, that same kind of earthy, just living life. And here they get the heavenly chorus of angels. You get Luke's beautiful telling of this extravagant, majestic, almost wasting of angelic gift upon these people. And that is, I think, the spirit that lives in Christmas at its best. When the music is playing, when the lights and the greenery and the snow-capped, little house village that you have in your house, whatever you decorate your home with, whatever communicates Christmas to your family, to the extent that it does inspire wonder, becomes an opportunity to see a wondrous God. The reformers have always called us to be careful of that. They've said that the instrument of seeing God can also be an instrument wielded by self to see ourselves. And we all know that this is a season where it's very easy to put ourselves at the center. So once again, do we come to these things with some level of discernment? Or do we come to them with some desire that we might see Christ in them? That said, I want to be very clear. I think to your point, and I want to circle back around maybe from my vantage, the church is tempted to make things binary, right? So you hear this conversation and you say, oh, wow, I never thought about Santa that way before. Maybe we need to get Santa out of our house. That's actually not really the effect I would hope this conversation would have. I think it's less about what do we need to put away, and rather more what have we been saying with the things that we have been doing. This is all about giving Christians agency to say that if this is indeed the day in which we celebrate God's miraculous salvation of humanity, God's desire to enter into the world to do for us what we could not do for ourselves, then it is natural and fitting and good that our celebrations would be big, that they would be filled with wonder and joy. They should be. But if we do those things without thought, if we find ourselves passive as opposed to active, then we find ourselves in a situation where we may be in situations that we should be uncomfortable.
Yeah, and I think to some extent we end up on the same ground here, and we certainly don't want to just repeat ourselves. But there is this, you mentioned Elf on the Shelf, the kind of image of the struggle for me, Michael, is perhaps you've seen it. It would be easy to Google if you haven't seen this. Used to be really popular. There is a picture of Jesus in the manger, and then Santa Claus is kneeling in front of the manger. And the idea was this was to show that Santa takes his place behind Jesus. Well, I always struggled with that image because it isn't true. Christmas in the world does not bow to Christmas in the church. The Santa of culture is not kneeling at the manger. The real question is, do we? And does our Christmas, if Santa represents Christmas for each of us, does it ultimately bow down and find its meaning, find its worth, find its value and its rootedness in the Christ child? Santa gives to kids who deserves it, right? Naughty, nice. Jesus offers grace to people who don't deserve it. Those are fundamentally different narratives. Now, can Santa be a part of your Christmas? Yes, we love that stuff. It's fun. Just understand that that is not the essence of what the church has tried to use these various tools to point to as we've celebrated Christmas for hundreds and hundreds of years. I don't think the church should be anti-Christmas. Christmas is ours. We made it. We recognized it. We didn't make it. But we came up with the idea of celebrating Christmas. It is our holiday. There's a lot of stuff that goes with it. Some of it good, some of it less good. And I think you're right. The discernment question is, how can we use those things? How can we enjoy those things? How can we hang lights and eat candy canes and give gifts and do all of that stuff in a way that is connected to our faith and honors the one we seek to be faithful to? And that's the question we all should wrestle with. And sometimes Christmas is so big, it's easy to do it without the struggle.
So I think one comment I want to make here, and prior to this conversation, I guess I've never quite realized this, Clint. Because the narrative is that between the two of us, I'm the one who's all in on Christmas, and you're the one who has some questions. I think the thing that I've never said is that there are many places in Christmas where I have lots of questions, right? So for me, listening to Christmas music and drinking eggnog and decorating the tree and the giving of gifts, all of these practices are deeply meaningful to me. There are some new ones that didn't come from my childhood. We have a practice in our home where we have 25, it's a spiral and it has 25 holes, and every day a candle gets closer to the center. And on the 25th day, just simply the manger gets put there. And for our family, that's a reminder of the light of the world coming. We have other practices that we do. The reality is, I think if Christians are living into Christmas faithfully, it will look as unique as the Christian and the family seeking to be faithful. You will navigate these waters in different ways than what other people will. You will have some things in your home that helps you celebrate this season, and you will have some things not in your home that you'll know people who do. I think that may be a good marker, to be perfectly honest, of have you taken agency? Have you given thought to these things? And I would say, do not fall into the trap of that binary, well, everything's got to go, or I need to completely redo I don't think that's the frame that we come to this conversation. I think it's rather, if you don't know the symbolism behind the thing, maybe learn it. If that thing for you merely connects you to a family person or a tradition of your family, or if that thing is somehow outside the realm of your faith, are you aware of that? Are you aware that this may not be inherently a Christ-miss thing? These are all opportunities, I think, for us to explore the faith. The problem with this season, Clint, is it's incredibly busy. We're all going to Christmas parties. We're all decorating the houses with this stuff. We're all buying the presents and trying to make sure can they arrive on time. I mean, we're in many ways trapped in the cycle of the world that surrounds us, of spinning up at this massive speed, that all of this kind of reflective, slow down, Adventish kind of work becomes very difficult, if not impossible, for us to do. And in fact, I have people who I know and love, even besides you, who I think their skepticism of Christmas has less to do with the actual stuff of Christmas, but rather the societal pressure that it needs to all fit and be perfect. Your schedule needs to be full, the cookies need to be made, this all needs done. And that overwhelming wall of stuff keeps them from feeling connected to the celebration of the season. And I don't have an answer to that other than to say, I think our constant and abiding task is to fight that so that we can celebrate the season.
Yeah, I think the reality is you can coast through Christmas doing very little of what Christmas is about. And I don't mean the trappings. I mean fundamentally about at its heart. And that means we don't want to do that. We want to be, as people of faith, we want to be attentive to the opportunities that season provides for us to make it about Jesus and to deepen our own faith and discipleship in that direction. And I think if we do that thoughtfully, carefully, joyfully, and thankfully, we have nothing to worry about. There's nothing about it that is inherently bad, though there are things we need to be aware of and we need to think about. And I think that's the case we're making throughout this. We'll conclude this season, this series in a week as we wrap up, as we come very close to wrapping up the Christmas season. And hopefully there's been something in today's conversation that maybe made you think. If you have questions, if you have follow-ups, let us know. Email call us, stop by the office, whatever it is. But we hope there's something in here that's maybe sparked some ideas.
So give some thought to the way that you deck the halls of whatever you do in your homes and in your places of work. And then I think we can also enthusiastically say, once you've given some thought, you can actually enjoy them as well for what they are.
Yeah, I would hope that even we might see those things in a new light, and that we might be moved by the fact that our mothers and fathers in the faith did those things as a sign of their faith, and maybe that could deepen the meaning for us as well.
Thanks so much for being with us, friends. Hope that if you found this interesting, or if you've been challenged or encouraged, you'd share it with someone else who you think would enjoy it. And we look forward to seeing you for the conclusion of this series next week.
Thanks, everybody.